Well, it is a great honor to be here, and I'm really delighted to speak about bridge building in our lovely city of Bridges. Don't we have a great city? Yeah. Well, when I was a bit younger, as a young teaching physician at the hospital, I found myself arguing with a homeless man. And despite the fact there was a snowstorm outside, he insisted on leaving against medical advice. I lost my argument with that man, and I later learned that he had frozen to death. As disturbing as his death was, it was even more disturbing when I heard some of my colleagues referring to him as a bumsicle. That man haunted me. Our hospital was supposed to be a place of healing, but he'd chosen to face death rather than to accept our care. And instead of asking ourselves why, we dehumanized him. I began to wonder if maybe the sickest patient was actually the healthcare system itself. Our system for years has been based on things like financial reimbursement, on fear of malpractice, and on a culture of power and control. But almost never have we actually really focused on the reality of our patients. And I thought maybe we should start exploring that reality. What a concept. I'll never know why that man chose to leave that night, but somehow his death wounded me, and I knew that my own healing was out there somewhere under the bridges of my city. I decided to make house calls to the homeless. Still, going under bridges was not normal doctor behavior, so I also decided not to tell my boss or my malpractice carrier. I was fortunate to find a guide who'd been formerly homeless, and when I met Mike, he was skeptical about taking a doctor with him. He said, you know they hate doctors, don't you? And I said, yeah, I kind of guessed that, but I was hoping I could change it. So he relented, and Mike's two rules to me were, 1, don't dress like a doctor, and 2, don't act like an asshole. So being an academic physician, of course, I went to the library, and I found to find a book on how to dress like a homeless person. And I actually found one, and I remember my 3 little boys came out in the yard, and they said, Daddy, what are you doing? I was putting dirt in my clothes and my hair. And so when I showed up, Mike said, well, at least you got the look. Soon we were exploring the riverbanks, alleys, and abandoned buildings of Pittsburgh 2 or 3 nights a week. And I was shocked at how many people were out there. There were veterans with PTSD, there were pregnant women, people with untreated diabetes, hypertension, and mental illness. Many were actually sick and dying. And I almost wished I didn't know how bad things were out there. One of my first patients was an elderly man, 85-year-old, with maggots in his legs. So, not knowing what else to do, I began to treat people on the street. So very soon, I got these referrals from one bridge to another by the homeless, saying, hey, go see Joe. And pretty soon, I had what would have been a thriving, wealthy practice if my patients were able to pay. But in fact, they did pay me with their gratitude. I remember one man crying by the riverbank saying, I can't believe someone cares that we're still alive. At night, when it was raining, I began to think of people I knew who were still out there. I was becoming part of their world. And then something really profound happened to my point of view. I began to see what the medical system looked like from the outside, and it wasn't pretty. But seeing through homeless eyes, I was also able to see how my system needed to be changed. And so, as Mike had been my ambassador to the streets, I would become their ambassador into the health system. Honestly, I had to, because lives were at stake. For example, one night, some of the guys ran and told me that old John didn't look well. When I got to see him, he was in a doorway complaining of abdominal pain. He didn't complain much, usually. And I knew it was serious, so I called the hospital, and they said they would be waiting. But when the paramedics showed up, they just looked at him with disgust. Don't worry about him, they said. Oh, we know him. He's just an old bum. Well, I explained I was actually a doctor, and that this man was very ill and needed to have treatment right away. So reluctantly, they took him to the hospital. And later I learned that he would have died that night without emergency surgery. People began to say to me, oh, those people, they choose to live like that. You know that. You can't help them. You're just enabling them. Well, my friend Richie taught me a really valuable lesson in what's actually possible. When we met Richie, he was sleeping not far from here in an abandoned loading dock in the Strip District in a pile of garbage and broken bottles and his own waste, really. He loved our visits, but nothing we could say would convince him to go seek medical attention or housing. Basically, Richie had given up on himself. So one night, I decided to do an experiment. We put on work gloves and we borrowed 20 infectious waste bags from the hospital. And we cleaned up all the stuff right around where Richie was sleeping. He just stood there holding one of our flashlights in amazement. When we were done, we had an area and we put a nice clean piece of carpet down for him to sleep on. And then 2 days later, one of our nurse volunteers came back and gave him a haircut and a tetanus shot. Well, I knew we were making progress when I visited him again the next week, and he had a bottle, but now it had flowers in it. And he showed us old pictures of his family. And within a month, Richie accepted housing in a group home. I went back to see Richie, and I asked him, do you have those photos of your family? He said, oh, I left them in the camp. So we drove back, and he found them. But as he was leaving, he stopped, and he just looked around. He said, Doc, how could a human being live in a place like this? And that was a really powerful moment for me because by showing Richie he had value, he was able to see that value in himself and begin the healing process. So I say we should never underestimate the potential of people, and we should also not underestimate the power of love. We also had our fun moments. One rainy, cold night, we were waiting in a McDonald's downtown for a medical student when a guy named Moses walked in. He had a cough, so I went over and I examined him, and I gave him some antibiotics. But just then the manager started yelling at me, saying, this isn't a damn clinic. You want to call an ambulance? And embarrassed, I said no, and I sat down. And shortly the medical student arrived, but then we saw police cars pulling up around the outside of the building. And pretty soon 3 or 4 cops came in, and the manager started to say, those two, that one, those two. And before I knew it, all the homeless, Mike, me, and the student were out in the cold, freezing rain. I felt terrible. Not only was I angry about how I'd been treated, but I'd gotten all the homeless people thrown out as well. And for a moment, I really felt a little bit of the prejudice with which my friends lived every day. The difference was I had resources. So I went to a bank machine, I withdrew $300, and I marched back into the McDonald's, and I threw the money on the counter, and I said, I'll take $300 of McDonald's gift certificates for the homeless, please. And they kind of looked at me and said, you know, the people you just threw out in the rain. And so I had the certificates. I showed them to Mike, and he said, I know who we can give these to. So that night, we found the dirtiest, smelliest guys we could find. And I said, here, take $10, but you've got to spend it on the one on Wood Street. So, we'll do it for you, Doc. So, an army of homeless paying customers descended on that particular store. Maybe by coincidence, it later went out of business. Soon other staff volunteers joined us to form Operation Safety Net, which was the first 24/7 service of its kind specifically for street people. Now, can you imagine? At 2 a.m, any homeless person could call and say they didn't feel well from the street. At 4 a.m, any ER doc could call to talk about a homeless person that they'd seen. And then we're able to go into their camps and make sure they have their medications and the follow appointments that they need. In the past 23 years, we've seen over 10,000 patients. And unlike when we started, many of them now have insurance and a primary care doctor. With our relationships, we've been able to get people into housing. We've housed over 1,200 chronically homeless people in their own apartments. And I'm really inspired by people that have the courage to reclaim their lives. When people are admitted to the hospital, our consult service is able to go see them, help the staff manage them, reduce their hospital stay, and also create a better discharge plan. As it turns out, the street homeless are some of the most frequent and costly utilizers of our healthcare dollars. I would highly recommend you read Malcolm Gladwell's New Yorker article, $1 Million Murray, in which he describes how just one homeless man cost the health system over $1 million in a year. We go into the camps and the streets, and we save this community millions of healthcare dollars every year. And I think as long as there are people sleeping on the streets, every community should have a program like ours, kind of like having a fire department. Unfortunately, going to where people are suffering the most is still pretty radical thinking for the healthcare system. But it's not rocket science. As I tell my students, you can't take care of a patient if you don't go in their room. But there's something far more important at stake here. We're losing the trust of those who need us the most. And I think this is a violation of our unspoken sacred contract with society. Our communities are watching us, and they want to know that we care about them. They know that healthcare isn't just a business. It's got to be about love, too. And the street homeless, once again, taught me a lesson about love. I made the mistake of telling a cardiology friend of mine that I was having a little chest pain. And pretty soon I was facing a cardiac catheterization. I'll admit I was frightened, so I said, knock me out. And when I woke up, there was Mike, looking relieved. My cath was okay. But then he handed me this envelope. And not knowing what it was, I opened it and I began to pull out these little pieces of paper. And when I realized what they were, I just began to cry. Each and every one was a note from one of the people on the street saying, "Don't die, Doc. We love you. And come back soon. We need you." I felt like Jimmy Stewart, in the It's a Wonderful Life. Exactly how I felt. And the last one really killed me. It was X. Old John did not know how to write, but even he could let me know that he cared. So it goes two ways. I mean, I have so much gratitude for the people I've known on the streets, my brothers and sisters out there. Well, by December of '93, I knew the value of my work. I had great people to work with, but I felt very much alone. There were no medical books on this, and I didn't know of anyone else doing this kind of work. So while traveling in India, I was so blessed to meet my friend, Dr. Jack Prager. He'd been working on the streets of Calcutta since 1979, and it was a watershed event for me because I realized we had both pioneered the same field of medicine. And since that time, I've traveled the world promoting what I now call street medicine. Programs began to emerge in places like Morgantown, Columbus, Santa Barbara, Prague, New Delhi, and Nigeria. A real quick thing on Nigeria. I was a State Department speaker there. And in the southern Christian tribal part of Nigeria, I got there and all the people said, "We've got to do this. This is who we are as Christians. This is who we are as tribal people." And I thought, that's great. And they started a program right here. Then I got to the north where there are Muslims and a different culture. And what really blew my mind was they gathered around and they said, "This is who we are as Muslims. This is who we are. We need to do this." And they started a program as well. So the power, I think, of this vision of helping our own people in our own cities who are fallen really has a lot of potential globally. Street medicine, I've helped create over 35 street medicine programs around the world, and 15 more are now in process. So street medicine is now a global movement since the days I put dirt in my hair. And to pull it together in 2005, right here in Pittsburgh, we had the first International Street Medicine Symposium. It was a quiet, humble event, that first one, but I also think it was historic because never before had the pioneers of this field been able to get together and talk about what they were doing. At our 10th meeting last year in Dublin, we had over 200 participants from 6 continents. Students are coming to Pittsburgh now from all over to see what we do, to work with us. And they go on to service careers, and many of them are starting their own programs, medical schools and nursing schools. It's a hot thing to do street medicine right now. They learn to connect not just as doctors, but as human beings. And I love the student leaders because they're like viruses. They're spreading across the planet, and they're demanding healthcare models now that embrace those who've been excluded by society. Nothing makes me happier than to see the fires of idealism in our future healthcare leaders. The Street Medicine Institute, also based here in Pittsburgh, was created to help other communities start their own programs. And through them, Pittsburgh is not just bridging gaps in the healthcare system, but we're actually bridging the peoples of the world in a vision of inclusion. Ultimately, it's about human connection. And just actually 2 months ago, a dear friend of mine on the street was tragically burned. In fact, his leg had to be amputated. I went to visit him, and as he lay in his hospital bed, I asked him, "Do you have any family?" I'll never forget a tear coming down his cheek, and he looked at me and he said, "You people are my family." That kind of connection is powerful, sacred stuff. And I knew that whatever happened, we would be in this together, and that felt really good. On the wall of the Albert Schweitzer Hospital in Haiti, I saw these words. They're from Lao Tzu from 500 BC, old wisdom. What blew me away was that they basically told me everything I'd learned on the streets. He said, "Go to the people. Live among them. Learn from them. Love them." It's hard for me to hug people, but I've learned. Serve them. Start with what they know and build on what they have. And when the work is accomplished, task is done, the people will say, "We have done this." We should all go to the people in our world who've been excluded. They may be under a bridge, or they may be right in front of us. The question is, do we have the courage to move into the reality of our brothers and sisters? I believe ultimately we have to, because as I tell my street friends, we're all in this together. Thank you very much.